Moving forward a bit quicker now into 1997, when Labour first came into power in the UK, we saw some move towards us, and they got rid of the grant-maintained schools. They allowed them to have some independence, but they were brought back into local authorities' control, but they kept all the other things in place. So all the delegated autonomy on hire and fire and all of that stayed with the individual schools, and all the kind of formula funding and schools having control over their budgets, all of that stayed, and we couldn't get them to get rid of the pay review body either. And as the Labour government carried on further, we then saw the beginning of what was laying the foundation for what the Tories have now done over the last few years. Because in 2002, the Labour Party introduced an Education Act which introduced what is called academies into the system. And these academies will be schools that are either run by sponsors or freestanding, but mostly in Labour's time it was sponsored academies, and these bodies would be either faith-based or business-based. So we had, for example, the Harris Carpets Academies. Staff did get a 10% discount if they wanted a new carpet, so I suppose there were some benefits in that particular area. But that was the way that Labour thought they would use this kind of system to actually tackle what they saw as underachievement in schools. So schools that were, in their view, failing, and failure is tested by the crude testing measures, where if you haven't got so many kids up to particular levels on those crude measures, doesn't matter about what your intake was or anything like that, and you're getting poor inspection reports, and the inspection reports are very, very firmly based on how you're working to get kids through these crude testing arrangements. If you got into that situation, then Labour's response was you then take the schools out of local authority schools, authority system, and give them across to some of these academy chains run by businesses or faith groups. And that was a hugely dangerous piece of legislation, and we campaigned very heavily against a number of these academies, and again we were reasonably successful. So by the time we got to the 2010 election, even though Labour had pushed this very, very hard, there was less than 200 schools who'd actually gone in that direction, because we managed to stop quite a lot. But then came this current government, and within days they put before Parliament another Education Act, the 2010 Academies Act, which has really introduced a lot of the massive challenges we actually now face with not only academies but something called free schools. Again, I'll come on to what that's about in a minute. And they rushed this legislation through in a way which hadn't been seen since a particular problem arose years before with rabies, and they had to introduce the Dangerous Dogs Act. And they whipped that legislation through Parliament, bypassing a lot of the checks and balances because they wanted it urgently, and the Tories did the same with the Academies Act. First time they rushed it through in a matter of weeks to get it onto the statute book, so we then had the Academies Act, and that not only intensified the forced academies route, so it enabled virtually no consultation to take place before the Secretary of State himself could actually say, I'm going to make that school an academy. So he could force, against whatever local opposition there was, he could force any school to become academies if they fell below floor targets. And of course the floor targets keep changing. So, if the floor targets aren't achieving what you want in the number of academies, you just increase the floor targets and more schools go below it. So the Force Academy programme was something that the Tories really pushed at. And then at the other end, what they also did was they introduced some preferential funding arrangements so that all schools that were good or outstanding could become freestanding academies as well. And you got extra funding for that. So they were driving it from one end, saying, here, come and freestanding, you'll get all these rights and responsibilities and everything else. You can come out that way. And also, if there's any schools they didn't think were performing well enough, or they wanted a lot at the other end, they were forcing them in that way. And in addition to the academies programme, they introduced this idea of free schools. Academies are ones where you've got an existing school and its status is actually changed and becomes no longer a community local authority school, it becomes an academy. Free schools are an initiative where anybody wants to start a school, you've got a good idea, come and tell us about it and you can set up a school. And you don't have to follow all the regulations about certain school buildings and things like that. Don't worry about that. Put in your bid, and never mind austerity. You know, we've got plenty of money around for that. You can actually take this money from ever. And the free schools that are being opened in areas where sometimes there's surplus school places already. And at the very time, we've got a situation where in some areas in England where we need new schools, there's no money for those new schools because he's pushing money into these free schools. The free schools, because they're new school, we don't have any recognition in. Whereas the academies, unlike the states, which they are in a far worse position than we are, but when an academy converts, all the rights under legislation of carrying across your pay and your conditions and your recognition rights come across into the academy status. So we still have recognition in all of the academies and the academy conversion chains. We don't in the free schools unless we can win a recognition battle in those particular individual schools.
Are they required to, I thought I'd heard that in a free school you didn't have to have a qualification.
No, absolutely, I was exactly coming on to that. And in not only in academies and free schools do they not need to employ qualified teachers, they don't also have to follow the national curriculum. So you've got Gove actually introducing, the government introducing a system where the national curriculum is absolutely essential. We've got to test it to the extreme and everybody must follow it. But in academies and free schools, no, you don't have to do that. And we've got to have higher standards and everything else. Qualified teacher status, don't need that in academies or free schools.
Do they get audited, I suppose? How do they?
They do still get inspected, and therefore very few academies will do that. Although the free schools, because they're relatively new, they've been given time before they get into that kind of inspection regime. So we wait to see how that actually fares. So what Gove has managed to do, our Secretary of State, Michael Gove, has managed to do, because he is absolutely driven on trying to ensure that there is as many academies and free schools by the time of this particular term of government. He's absolutely driven on this. He has managed, by these various mechanisms, to actually get almost 50% of our secondary schools into academy status. And he's using the forced academy process to try and actually drive up the number of primary schools. Because primary schools, why do you want to actually go away from all the kind of support mechanisms and the collaboration with your local schools into becoming either freestanding or be chucked into one of these national chains? So there's not been lots of primary schools moving or wanting to move in that direction, so Gove's had to force them. But academies in the secondary school are now about half. And a lot of those saw the money and thought, right, we will take the money and we will come out of local authority control. And they've got complete freedom over not only whether they follow the national curriculum, but also whether they carry on with national pay and conditions. They are able to use whatever pay and conditions they actually want.